Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm speaking to a historian and journalist who was born in a country that no longer exists. That country is the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany as it's more commonly known. The historian and journalist is Katja Hoyer, and her latest book, Beyond the Wall, is a history of the GDR that explores what it was really like living there, what she refers to as an account that doesn't fit nicely into the story that must be told of German history. Now, as regular listeners will know, I spend a lot of time in Germany. I'm actually in the process of moving from London to Munich, and I also had family that lived in East Germany, so there's a personal interest for me in this subject. But there are also some fascinating human risk dynamics, not just in the contents of the book, but also in the experience that Katja had writing it and in the reaction to it. Katja is a research fellow at King's College London, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a columnist for a number of publications, including the Washington Post and the Spectator. Beyond the Wall is her second book on German history, and it shines a light on what it was really like to live in the GDR. As Katja explains on the show, she wanted to capture both the good and the bad of a country that stopped existing when she was just a few years old. Unlike most histories of the GDR, she wanted to explore the bad and the good. So as well as covering the Stasi, East Germany's famous secret police, and the other oppressive sides of the regime, she also wanted to explore the positives. In 1989, for example, the GDR had one of the highest rates of female employment in the world. Now, I've been trying to get Katja on the show for ages, but for reasons that will become obvious, she's been in incredibly high demand. Beyond the Wall and its German translation are bestsellers. All of which means that there are lots of other podcasts on which you can hear Katja talk about what's in the book, and I've put links to some of those in the show notes. So in our discussion, while we obviously do talk about the book, including getting some fascinating insights into the behavioural dynamics of the Stasi's operations and the prevalence of paranoia amongst the leadership, I spend time talking to Katja about her experiences. Why, for example, is a German historian based in the UK? What was it like writing the book? How easy was it to get people to talk about their experiences? And as someone who travels a lot, I really wanted to hear more about something she refers to as soul lag. That's when we travel across borders and our bodies move faster than our souls. Most intriguingly of all, the timing of our discussion meant that I had the chance to talk to Katja about the reaction to her book. In Germany in particular, she's been, wrongly in my opinion, accused of sanitizing the realities of life in the GDR. As she explains, that's because the narrative of her book doesn't fit nicely into what she calls the story that must be told about German history. We also end the show by getting an exclusive preview of Katja's new book, which she's about to start writing, that explores the German city of Weimar. I'll let her tell you all about that. With that introduction out of the way, please enjoy, and I absolutely mean that because Katja is an incredibly fun guest, my discussion with Katja Hoyer as we go behind the wall. Katja, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here because I'm a big fan of both the books that you've published, but also the other things you do. But to start us off, you're in what one might term a sort of slightly surprising position in that you're a German historian studying it and researching it in the UK and doing a little output in English. And I'm fascinated how that came about.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds stranger than it is. It actually gives me a huge advantage in that you're not right in the middle of the thing that you're describing, be that current day stuff or history, which is, of course, often, linked to political things today. So in a way, it's quite nice sitting in a political and historical exile and writing about something that you're not permanently surrounded by, and that helps. How it came about is a pretty long and boring story. I knew I didn't want to live and work in Germany for various different reasons, not least because of the way academia is still sort of very formal and niche and stuffy in my view. And I wanted to go somewhere else where I could kind of work and write more freely, but I didn't know where. So I ended up for a while in Singapore and then in Malaysia, and then via different routes ended up in Britain, where I felt very at home in the culture here and in the way that you can sort of write and talk fairly freely, even if you don't come from a traditional sort of background that fits, career trajectory that fits into what one might expect. I feel people are a bit more open-minded about kind of people coming into field from different angles and different sides and different experiences, and that's been quite an attractive sort of position to be in.
And you've talked a lot about that external perspective. You mentioned it just then, and it fascinated me because logically, I would have expected you to write in German, and yet, for example, the book that we'll come on and talk about, you decided to write in English. Which, why not? I guess, but it intrigued me that you'd gone that far to step outside, and that you've adopted that as your main language of communication. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I live and work and write here, which means I also write for an Anglophone in the widest sense of the word sort of audience, be that here in the UK or US as well, where I also write for newspapers and things. So for me, it's also about explaining Germany to others. So that's also a part of what I do, particularly in newspapers where people are often a bit confused what the Germans are up to again, and I try and sort of put things into perspective. So that's one aspect of it. And it's also quite liberating in a way because you don't have to engage necessarily with the sort of language and register that's been used by German academics and German scholars. So you can actually, by adopting a new language, almost try and frame the dialogue in a different way. It frees you up to not sort of either go with or against what's already there. And you can find your own way of expressing things that is a little bit less tied to kind of pre-existing frameworks of kind of reference.
Come on and talk about the book, which is fabulous. Hence, I definitely wanted to get you on the show. But a lot of your other writing, particularly you have a newsletter called Zeitgeist that I think is just absolutely fascinating, and you cover topics that they're relevant to what you're researching, and yet you're also just exploring life. And you wrote recently about something that really grabbed my attention, which was this idea of soul lag, and that had come from your travels. And I just wanted to explore that. Can you just explain to people what that is?
Yeah, I mean, people that travel a lot will know what I mean. It is a very strange thing when you travel between different countries in particular, and now with sort of air travel, it happens very quickly. So you're in a place sort of 1.5 hours after you left one place, and suddenly there's a different language, a different currency, a different cultural world around you, and your mind and your soul really hasn't got time to catch up with that. I think, back in the day when it took you, say, weeks or months sometimes to get somewhere by boat or coach or horse or on foot, there was a lot of time to take in this kind of physical transition and cultural transition from one place to another. I think the most extreme example that I sometimes feel is sort of going to France, when you actually take, even by car, which is obviously faster than people used to travel, but when you go there by car and you cross the channel or you do it on the ferry, you can kind of physically see where you're going. And you arrive in a different place having traveled hours already. It's a slightly different thing because you have kind of time to mentally adjust. Whilst getting into a plane and, getting out somewhere that's completely different, it's always very disorientating. And when you do that, as I have over the last 2 weeks, with several different countries, within a week, I've sort of gone from Hamburg back to London, Berlin to a village in Brandenburg, and then to Washington via Munich, and then back to Berlin via Zurich. And by the time that I landed in Zurich and suddenly I was on this like monorail from one part of the airport to another, and suddenly sort of, totally disorientated from the long flight on which I hadn't slept very much. And suddenly cows appeared like on displays around me.
I know the one. Yeah.
And people were yodeling at me, and that was it. That finished it off for me. So it's very much a kind of the idea that your body travels faster than your mind and your soul do.
And I love this idea. You talked about it was almost what I would term anchoring, which is kind of like you talked about, you found yourself in Munich airport, and so I've got to eat something and drink something that's local just to have a sort of sense of participation. And so I thought there was this lovely sort of attempt to connect with wherever you are to try and manage that. And I thought that was a very interesting, well, because a lot of people just sort of fight on through. And my sense was in the way that you explore the world, and you strike me as being a very sort of curious, in a positive sense, curious person who just sort of wants to engage with everything that's around them and understand things and make sense of it. And so I love this idea of you anchoring yourself to where you were, even if you were only there for a very short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking a careful balance. If you do that too much, so if you immediately kind of throw yourself in there, it's also very confusing and disorientating. So whilst I try and do that, I mean, even in Zurich, I sort of briefly stopped on the way between one flight and the other and just had a look what's in the shops, because airports in particular always try and sort of have some form of local section, for tourists to pick something up last minute. So that's always quite interesting how countries kind of portray themselves almost to strangers and to foreigners to them. So I try and do that. But at the same time, I also tend to continue to read, say, my social media stuff or newspapers from the UK. Or often I have one book on the go, quite often a long one, so that it keeps me anchored to that, a fiction book, keeps me anchored to that particular story over, a number of hours, so that I can read the same thing and be kind of in that particular world, in my mind at least, no matter where I am, basically. So there are also other ways of kind of tying you back to kind of where you were in many ways. So it's trying to find a balance between not confusing myself too much, but also realizing where you actually are and allowing that to have an impact on you as well.
That's interesting about fiction, because one of the things that strikes me about your writing is it's very much a storytelling element, and particularly the last book that we'll come and talk about is, there's a lot of human interest. You're talking about real people and their real experiences, and so I'm intrigued by the fiction piece. Are you reading things that are relevant to your research, or is it other things that stimulate you?
I do. I usually have one non-fiction book on the go or something that is culturally relevant to what I'm researching. So it might be, I don't know, if you're reading something about, or if you're doing something about Nazi Germany, you might want to read, like, I don't know, Christopher Isherwood, Goodbye to Berlin, those kinds of things that are relevant to that. So there's always one thing that I read, often also for reviews that I'm writing, book reviews. And then I try and read something completely different. So for instance, I love Stephen King books. It's just one of
Wow.
those. Completely different, completely out there, but still with lots of kind of human pondering and musings about kind of the big questions in life that still somehow are relevant to your kind of thinking, but it's a different world that you're in. And because he's so wordy, quite often you kind of spend sort of weeks and months reading his books. And that, again, no matter where you are, you can sit in a hotel room somewhere and dip into the same book that you read at home the day before. And it keeps you tied to that particular kind of mind frame in a way that is quite comforting, because you can kind of withdraw from where you are when you need to.
I love the idea of Stephen King being comforting.
Yeah, it's maybe the wrong word. Maybe the wrong word.
No, but I know it. But I think it's interesting, because I mean, a lot of the subjects that you're studying, and obviously, German history is fraught with some pretty horrific elements, and so I wondered whether your choice of fiction was to try and get you away from that, because at its serious end, there's some we know there's some horrific stories and horrific things and so part of me was expecting you to say, I want something that completely distracts me. But is that particular genre that you're after, or is it just Steve? Because he's a great writer, right? Regardless of the genre aside.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It has to be really, really immersive, and not many writers can do that. It needs to be so credible and so well written, and the characters need to be so well designed that you actually kind of, get sucked into the story in a way that takes your mind off other things. The moment I get bored, even like within a page, your mind's back on, like you're writing yourself, your mind's back in the book or back on the article, or back on some debate you had where you got annoyed about what somebody said, or, that kind of thing. So it has to be incredibly powerful in the writing, and not many writers can do that. And Stephen King is one of those. Over time as well, I've started reading his books when I was sort of a teenager, sneaking them out of the library, hoping that the librarian wouldn't ask my age or anything, and just being
Right.
grateful that, unlike films, they haven't got age ratings on them. So there's also an author that has kind of accompanied me in a way, kind of through my life. So it's comforting only in not obviously in the subject matter, but in the sense that you feel almost like the characters. You can kind of relate to them and their sort of the way that they respond to the things that they encounter, even though the things that they encounter are, of course, very unusual, which is the sort of escapist element of it, I suppose. So I'm also very drawn to things that are very different from the world that I'm in. So, kind of horror, fantasy, science fiction, medieval stuff. So those kinds of things that are really completely different from my own world.
Wow. And let's talk about that world, because Beyond the Walls, I mean, it's a fabulous read. And from my personal perspective, lots of things I learned. But let's go back. I've heard you talk a lot on other podcasts and interviews you've done about the book, about the fact that you wanted to write a history that was missing. And I love this idea. I mean, it's not great for you from an identity perspective, but I love this idea that you were writing about a country that no longer exists. And in fact, the place that you were born no longer exists. Can you just explain that for people? Because that, I mean, it sounds like a very strange thing to say. Obviously, physically they exist, but they don't in terms of identity.
Yeah, it is very peculiar, growing up with that knowledge. I mean, when we think of countries, we don't normally mean, a particular physical structure or a particular river or whatever. We're thinking of them as kind of quite abstract ideas, almost political ideas. When we think of, I don't know, France, for example, you don't necessarily expect it to look exactly the same today as it did 500 years, but somehow there's still a kind of, reference point there where you still think of that place as France. And so with East Germany, given that it just doesn't exist anymore, it's a really odd thing to sort of ponder and think about the fact you were born in a country that if you open a kind of atlas or a map or something today, it just isn't on there anymore. And the same goes for the city that I was born in, which is Wilhelmshaven, which was named after the first and only president of the GDR. And that too is only called Guben now. And in my passport, it still says Wilhelmshaven. So it's also odd to, just these kind of things that were normal to the people at the time when I was born and just aren't anymore. It feels a world away now. With all of its politics and everything else, it just completely vanished. And so it's just a really interesting concept. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, is almost kind of going back and exploring what that place was like and what it would have been like for people that lived there. So almost the idea, had I been sort of 10, 20, 30 years older, what was the country like that I would have lived in and would have tried to sort of, build a life in.
And of course, I mean, the history of East Germany, if we look at the sort of popular thing, there are two classic themes that emerge, which is one is the Stasi, and the second one is a sort of escape attempts over the Berlin Wall. And those are the sort of two classic ones that are there. And so what I thought was really interesting about what you'd written is you covered those. And I do want to come on and talk about some of the critique that you've had from people that many of whom I don't think have actually read it. But there's those classic things, and what you were trying to write was the as well as covering it, but it was the other side of it, is the human nature, the day-to-day life that went on at that time. And so what I loved was that you started each chapter with a sort of eyewitness accounts, really talking about what people were experiencing in day-to-day life in that world.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea wasn't necessarily to separate those experiences from politics. I think quite often we do that. So when we describe sort of, say, a constitution that was written, or the way that a government worked, or the way that a police state operate, we tend to almost divorce that from the experience that the people then have that have to live in that structure or under those rules or whatever it may be. So kind of telling some of the elements from their perspective isn't necessarily saying that there's a kind of gulf between their experience and what politics is. I try and sort of tell the story of the German Democratic Republic, as it was ironically called, and the experience of the people within that in tandem. So the idea is that even some of these vignettes and the anecdotes directly link to, the sort of big state history of that. It's not a social history in the pure sense. It was just trying to humanize, basically, in the widest possible sense, a history that can be perceived as quite sort of abstract. So people talk about the Stasi, the secret police, and the wall, and the kind of dictatorship and all of that, with this sort of blank grey mass of people living there, but people don't really imagine sort of faces and stories and, funny things and all of this other stuff that happened at the same time. So even when I talk about the foundation of the state, I use a young member of the Communist Party who would later go on to become Margot Honecker, the wife of the second leader of the GDR, as an example of somebody who's sort of young and excited and stands there with a bunch of flowers in her hands, waiting for the president to finish his speech before she can congratulate him. And that's not to say, I sort of agree with her standpoint. It's just trying to make the reader feel that they're there and they're seeing this thing through the eyes of an actual person, as opposed to me just explaining how the Constitution works, which I then go on to do. But it's kind of, you've already got some sort of way in that makes it a bit more relatable and understandable, that history.
And the bit that fascinated me, and with hindsight, what I thought was really interesting was you answered loads of questions that I wish I'd asked when I was kind of studying this at school. And the bit that fascinated me was the sort of start point for the GDR, because I had always assumed that it was simply a case of, the Russians have decided to do this. But you tell a fascinating story about German exiles and what drove the foundations of the GDR. And I guess I'd never really thought about the human drivers for what was happening. But the fascinating backstory there that I think really is very revealing.
Yeah, I think so too. That's why I spend so much time in the book. I mean, people often ask that question and say, your book cover says that you started in 1949. So why are we hearing things about
You've got your
that,
dates wrong.
yeah, like decades earlier, basically. So yeah, no, I think it is highly relevant because again, going back to this human element, whatever one thinks of the people that ended up dictating politics from the top, they are still people, and they come with a particular mindset and particular experiences and the sort of baggage really of what they've experienced before, psychologically in particular. And it's kind of naive to imagine that they come out of nowhere in 1949 and just randomly decide to set up a dictatorship to torture people. You know, so what I was trying to do there is explain where these people come from ideologically, and also that's why I go back quite a long way, even to the First World War, and because I do still think it's the sort of arch catastrophe of the 20th century, and from which a lot of other things spring. And that also has an impact on communism and socialism in Germany, and then basically those experiences are sort of deepened and worsened during the Nazi experience of sort of persecution and death and concentration camps for German communists, and a lot of them end up in Soviet Russia, where they expect paradise, this kind of workers and peasants paradise that they've been told since the 1920s, or basically since 1917, since the Russian Revolution, is happening there. This is a thing that everybody had just conceived in their minds. I mean, communism just didn't exist in its concrete form before 1917. And Marx had been saying, in the middle of the 19th century that it was going to come soon, and all the sort of socialists and communists were waiting. And then suddenly it appears, and people, because the expectations were so high and the propaganda was so intense, people kind of imagined that that would be kind of the realization of all these things that they've been dreaming of. And when they arrive there, they find sort of Stalinist terror rather than the sort of socialist utopia that they were hoping for. And that experience in itself means that a lot of them get murdered or end up in the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, and only a small proportion, a tiny proportion, actually survive the Second World War of them. And, as I describe in the book, there's a reason if you survive that. It's very, very few of them survive by sheer luck, just because of the ruthlessness of Stalin. I mean, he actually issued what was known as a German order. Basically, the order said that all Germans are to be apprehended and sort of dealt with, which in many cases meant death, or displacement. So it was that ruthless that if you kind of came out the other end, you had to have done something quite remarkable to convince Stalin and the regime that you were worth keeping, and that you were indeed loyal and not just a kind of fifth columnist for Hitler. So that already reduced the kind of German communists, among whom were, lots of kind of dreamers and idealists to start with. We often forget that because we associate communism with Stalin, but many people in the 1920s and earlier had not, sort of seen Stalin's terror yet, because it hadn't happened yet. And so they kind of genuinely believed that there was a better way of doing things, because they lived in poverty and lived in pretty horrendous conditions. But those weren't the people that survived, because when they found out what Stalin was really up to, quite often, obviously, they either fell victim to it or became opponents to that idea, and then fell victim to it. So who's left really is the people who are willing to denounce others, who are willing to make sacrifices in the sort of vaguest sense of that word, to show how loyal, how fervent they were about communism. And those are the people that got sent back at the end of the Second World War to Germany to build up political and social and economic structures in Stalin's zone of occupation. And that's easy to forget, but it's hugely important, because they're still the same people that run the GDR right to the very end. And that's something that people often forget. Even in the 1980s, you still have Erich Honecker, who sat in a Nazi prison for 12 years nearly, right almost from the beginning to the end. Having that experience. You've got Erich Mielke, who was trained who basically wasn't involved in the murder of two policemen in the early 1930s. And then ended up being trained as a terrorist in Moscow, and admiring the entire sort of Cheka system, secret police system built up there. He's still in charge of the Stasi right to the end. People forget that that's the mindset and the backdrop and the kind of pool of experiences that people come with. And the paranoia that stems from that time, I think, explains a lot in terms of why the Stasi was set up the way that it was, and why it continued to operate completely as a kind of anachronistic remnant of that time, why it continued to survive for so long.
And you paint a picture in the book about, because of those dynamics, and when we look at the sort of denazification after the Second World War, there are lots of people in positions that shouldn't be in those positions, that don't necessarily have the skill sets to take them. And so as the country is being rebuilt on different lines, obviously you don't want the people that are responsible for it before to be in charge of anything. And so you tell some great stories about people that frankly were ill-equipped to handle the tasks that were put before them.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to forget. I mean, this is the exact problem that people had in the British, American, and French zones as well, is that you basically take over from a Nazi state that was so insidious and so good at propaganda, that it had seeped into every aspect of society. If you were still a teacher in 1945, or a lawyer, or a doctor, you were a kind of, somebody who had at best collaborated with the Nazi system and sort of kept their head down. But that's the kind of limit of how far you can go towards the excusatory side, or at worst, you were a completely convinced Nazi who was doing what they were doing out of conviction. And so very quickly, the idea of thoroughly denazifying society became impractical on all sides. And the British and the Americans, after the zones were sort of merged, decided very quickly that actually they can't do this. It doesn't really work. If they want to revive Germany, and at that point they needed what become West Germany as a sort of bulwark against Stalin and the kind of perceived threat of, or real at the times as well, threat of kind of communism on the other side. So they decided to kind of do a bit of a bodge job with it, to put it mildly, and just basically put the kind of chief people that one knew on trial, and use them as a sort of means to say, right, we've punished the Germans now, and let's move on. But that meant that people were left in positions, in law, in politics, and policing, and everywhere else, basically, where you had former Nazis there for various different reasons. Whilst in the East, the ideological kind of umbrella under which all of that happened was much, much more rigid. And the idea was that you just need to get rid of these people no matter what. It doesn't matter what you end up with, even if it's a society and the economy that doesn't get going. And so the Nazification was a lot more thorough, not perfect either by any stretch of the imagination, but it meant you now had people, it literally just come from the East, from the territories that Germany had lost, so like East Prussia and those bits, had lost everything there, but were often, because those regions were quite sort of agrarian, so quite often they were, like farmers and farmhands and people like that, tradesmen. And they'd come to Germany, and then suddenly they were told, right, you're going to teach like an A-level class in physics now, because we sacked the Nazi teacher. So,
Which is kind of funny, right? But then you think about the realities of what that means.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I mean, think a step further what that means for lawmaking, for example. So you suddenly had somebody like that, making decisions over like court cases and stuff, because the entire sort of judiciary was culled more or less as well. So you ended up, think policing, like suddenly somebody was just given some sort of armband to put around. They didn't even have uniforms to start with. They'd put an armband around them, say, right, you're a policeman now. You make sure that nobody sort of steals and murders and rapes in this part of town. And again, no training, no structure behind that. So there's a huge issue for the GDR, sort of alongside all the other burdens that it faced. To begin with, was this kind of comparatively thorough denazification.
And you mentioned that element of paranoia that led to the Stasi and the way they did things. And one of the things that surprised me, but again was obvious once you'd explained it, was that the volume of data they were collecting was insane. And you make the point, which I hadn't really thought about before. I had assumed it was all a slick system and that you capture everything was all useful. But you make the point that there's a lot of data that was captured that you couldn't really do anything with. And so in a way, the mechanism for capturing it was great, but the mechanism for actually doing something useful with it wasn't always there.
Yeah, I mean, that's because there wasn't really a particular target under which these things were collected, especially as things escalated over time. I mean, initially, the Stasi kind of sold itself to the party as the sword and shield of the party. That was the motto. So this is basically the the Stasi and Erich Mielke saying to the politicians, like, we're the ones that will protect you from opposition people and people who might seek to undermine the system in some form. And they move quite far away from that as the paranoia sort of increases over the years. It doesn't help, as I say, that you still have kind of old art communists and people who were already kind of a nasty piece of work to begin with, still in charge then, and kind of escalating their paranoia as they get older even further. I mean, I quote a speech from Mielke where internally he says to his staff, there are, I think, 6 types of Germans or 7 types, I can't remember.
I love this.
And he just goes like through the list and goes from sort of outright opponent down step by step. But apart from one category amongst those 6, like they're all opponents of the regime. Some of them don't even know yet that they are opponents, but they will be because they're sort of subtly being westernized and sort of brought up by, foreign influences, Western music and stuff like that. So if you follow that logic that, basically 1/6 or 1/7 of the population is either predisposed to become an opponent one day or is already there, then you got to monitor that amount of people to make sure that the state is safe. And also, if people themselves don't even know yet that they're going to be, a dissident one day, then you got to monitor them until you find that point at which they're kind of turning in order to make sure that you catch them at the right time. And so follow that logic, and it means you got to constantly watch what everybody says and thinks and does. But the problem with that is, of course, that you accumulate a huge amount of data. And secondly, because so many people because the Stasi, like the Gestapo before, under the Nazis, which had much, much smaller numbers and staff, by the way, it's an interesting comparison between the two. But both of these institutions realized very quickly that they cannot watch everybody's move all the time. It's impossible. You can't ever have that much staff, kind of on rota. And so the Stasi resorts to a system whereby they create sort of citizen spies, if you will, informal informants, they were called. And so people who are ordinary people spying on other people. And they were partially doing this because they wanted to, and felt that they were doing kind of their duty as a citizen. But many, many people felt it was just part of the cause if you wanted to get anywhere in life. It was hard to say no to the Stasi. So say you wanted to be, I don't know, a university professor. And whilst you were at university as a student, the Stasi would approach you and say, like, can you do us a favor and we'll do you a favor, sort of thing. And eventually, this furthers your career and it helps you. Also, your children, sometimes, even if you're not willing to do it for yourself, you might not want to stand in the way of your children's prospects and things like that. And partially it was outright coercion and threats. So, they kind of let you know that they're monitoring you or your family members or whoever. And unless you do this, like, bad things will basically happen, or opportunities will be cut. So because of that, you also end up with a lot of false stuff in there. People will just kind of say, of course I went out there and watched this man sort of in the evening and he switched the television on and then did the washing up, and just put like harmless stuff in there and either leave things out or outright falsify stuff as well, because it's not really, like, they can't check that, can they, in terms of fact checking it. So lots of people have told me, when I did my interviews and things, and also just over the years talking to people, that there's so much crap in their Stasi files as well that it's just not true. And they kind of read that and think, no, I didn't, or no, I didn't even know that person, or whatever. So, that's another problem, because the Stasi doesn't actually know which part of the information is actually true. And the third issue was simply economic, again, because the GDR struggled all the way through. So, for example, in terms of like cassette tapes to record conversations and things, they just didn't have enough of them. So they were recording a conversation, and then very quickly a member of staff would have to decide, is this relevant? Do we need to keep this or not? If it was relevant, it had to be transcribed onto paper and then basically put away somewhere, filed away, and then the cassettes were deleted or they were deleted straight away. So even in the 80s, they were still not able to actually keep everything that they collected. So it's much messier than people imagine when they have this kind of really efficient police state in their minds. I mean, it was efficient and ruthless. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to make this sound more harmless than it is, but equally, it wasn't a perfect system that one couldn't kind of live under or beneath or aside of.
And you mentioned that you spoke to people, and it's as I said before, it's heavy on stories. Were people willing to talk to you about everything? Were there challenges in that? I mean, I'd imagine that given you came from there, you get access in a way that somebody from outside might not. But I could imagine there'd be things that people wouldn't necessarily want to talk about as well.
Yeah, I mean, it did help that I was from there because, for one thing, it helped me find people to talk to in the first place. So what I was not trying to do is replicate what's already there. There are tons of recorded testimonies in the archives and in German museums and things. But the problem is that when people ask for these, so when a museum or an archive says we want so-called Zeitzeugen, so witnesses of the time, is a very German notion, that somebody can be like a historical source, basically themselves. People come forward who think they have something to tell, and, like, if you think about that for a minute, if I stop the average.
Self-selecting witnesses,
It
right? Yeah.
really is, yeah. I mean, if you stop the average person on the street and you kind of ask them, um, you know, to come to a museum and tell the story of their life in Britain, and people would think, that I'm going to work. I've done things. Okay, I go on holiday. You know what I mean? But they don't really see themselves as kind of witnesses of the great stories of the time or something, unless they were part of it one way or another. So in lots of cases, this is very, very heavily dominated by dissidents, opponents, people who had some sort of political history of one shape or another, whilst kind of ordinary people, and whatever that means, sort of think of themselves as ordinary people and their story isn't worth recording. So what I was trying to do is finding people who um, had really interesting stories to tell, but didn't know that they have interesting stories to tell. So quite often for me, it was like, for instance, I wanted to know what it's like to work on the gas and oil pipes in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had sort of made a deal with its brother states that it would deliver cheap gas and oil to them if the brother states help build up the infrastructure for it. So there were these work projects that one could sign up for, and then you'd be sent out there into the literally into the middle of nowhere somewhere in the Soviet Union to build a section of the pipeline. So they were looking for like welders and builders and all sorts of people. But it means kind of you're signing up for that for 2 or 3 years. You're away from your family. You're literally in the middle of nowhere with other people that you've never met in your life before, and you're shut off from the rest of the world. So to me, it was really interesting to see, why would somebody do that, and
Right.
what was their experience like. So I just asked around, and eventually somebody said, "Yeah, I know somebody who did that." And then I talked to that person, and I found out very quickly that actually the story is very interesting, because they felt they couldn't really escape from this very small and stuffy world that the GDR had become in the 1980s. And there was nothing for them in life. He said, I went to work day in and day out. It was just boring. Yes, I had my family and my garden and things. It was a nice sort of quiet life in that sense, but he wanted something exciting to happen in his life. So this was the one time that you could have an adventure, go out there, do something different, earn a lot of money as well. It was much better paid. They looked after them really well. So they had these like banquets, and the stars of the GDR music scene came out to sing for them and stuff like that. So, if you could live with the fact that you were away, it was actually kind of, quite you didn't have any worries. Like, your bed was made every day, your room was cleaned, you got fed very well, there was plenty of alcohol. If you could live with the fact that you're sitting amongst a bunch of other men, like, for 3 years basically, you'd come home and you'd be able to buy a car immediately, which obviously was, there were long waiting times, so that was in itself quite a boon. So it's just stories like that I was kind of after, and that in itself I could then use to talk about this kind of sense of stagnation in the 1980s and the ways that people tried to deal with that. So it did help. Having said that, a lot of people were incredibly reluctant and skeptical because of the way that GDR history has basically been written by people who were opponents or dissidents largely over the last 30 years. People were kind of looking for good East Germans to write the history in the way that, as a dictatorship, as an oppressive regime, in a way that it was deemed to be kind of pedagogically helpful for the German nation in itself, kind of to see the GDR. So people who kind of went along with the system were suddenly cast as at best bystanders, at worst perpetrators. So there was, for a long time, this is the actual phrase that people used, the GDR was a society of perpetrators and victims. So for a while you fell into one or the other category kind of officially, and that made it very, very difficult to talk about kind of experiences that would cast you almost as a perpetrator, even though you weren't, you didn't see yourself at that as that time. So people were very skeptical when a historian comes along and says, I'm writing a book about the GDR. They think they know where it's going because all of the previous books were written that way. So I sometimes had a very hard time convincing people that I was genuinely there to listen to their story and just wanted it to be part of the story of the GDR, in a way that hadn't been done before. And that sometimes took some convincing and some sort of sitting down with people over schnapps and waiting for them to sort of loosen up and start to trust you.
But I guess that kind of proves your point, right? Is that actually what you're trying to do here is to tell the story that hasn't been told and the human side of it. And certainly, what I found really interesting was the focus on everyday stories of everyday life. So whether that's the fact, the huge amounts of women were employed in the state in a way that even now we don't see in the West. And you tell some great stories. I'm going to get you to tell the story about the jeans because that just got me. I thought that was absolutely insane. But you were pulling out these stories. I guess that if you looked at the statistics, you know the fact that lots of women were employed, but actually you really were trying to dive a little bit beneath that and sort of go, this is what went on, and this is the human side of it that hasn't, as you say, with your accounts of talking to people, that hasn't really been aired before in this way.
Yeah, and I think that's important as well because a lot of this stuff is just forgotten. Because Germany has a tendency, for understandable reasons, but given the Nazi trauma that still lingers, Germany has got a tendency to tell history with a purpose, with a reason. So, for instance, German memorials. I've written a piece on that as well. German memorials are called Mahnmale, so they're not memorials in the actual sense, but they're memorials. So Mahnen means to warn. So if you have a Mahnmal, it's like a memorial that warns you of something from history, that delivers a warning from history. And that's a very strange thing to think about when you come from Britain or the US or Russia or whatever, where people have memorials to kind of celebrate people or events or whatever, to have very kind of inspiring and moving pieces that make you look up to somebody. Whilst in Germany, even at the heart of the nation, at the heart of the capital, you've got this giant memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, as it's called, is huge. And that's right at the heart of Berlin because it still sees this as a foundation thing. So the same is true with the GDR, and as seen as the second dictatorship, it's used to teach students today, children today, that they should value their democracy, that they should go voting because they have the right to do that when their forebears didn't. So all of that is all valid, but it does mean that anything that doesn't neatly fit into that narrative and isn't pedagogically kind of valuable to the German,
Which is sort of ironic, right? Given given what we're talking about.
and it's something is one of the many reasons why I'm reluctant to work in Germany because I find that still, I'll say to people, but this happened, this is why it's in the book, or this is why I'm telling the story, and people go, oh, but you can't say that. People will think it was wonderful in the GDR. I was like, no, they don't. People have got their own minds to think about these things and put them in context. But there's a real anxiety and kind of reluctance to tell stories and elements of something that kind of contest, well, not even contest, but that stands sort of side by side with the story that must be told in the way that people see it. So the problem with GDR history is exactly that, that you kind of, this is also explains partly the controversy around the book, is that there's so many things in there. One example that I always get challenged over in Germany is tell the story of a contract worker from Cuba, Jorge Noguera, who basically was part of a contract working scheme that the GDR had set up where it sort of brought people over from foreign countries for a contractual period, usually 2 or 3 years, where they were learning a skill in Germany as it was the kind of most developed of the socialist nations. And then they were supposed to go back and build up the socialist economies in what was mostly developing countries at the time so that the GDR could eventually trade with them. That was part of its problem, is it couldn't trade with anybody because it was the wealthiest of the bloc nations and found it very difficult to sell stuff to other countries that didn't have the money to. So I explained that, and then I use kind of the story that Jorge told as an example of how it's not an immigrant society. I'm trying to draw a very clear line there and say it's very different from Western societies because these people didn't come as refugees or even economic migrants. They came specifically for that time period that they were contracted for. The GDR actually made economic losses with that because they had to house them and feed them. Whilst most of the German scholarship focuses on the way that they were segregated from society, there was no effort to integrate them. There was racism in society and all of that sort of stuff. So I say each time, but this is what he said. This is his experience, and there are experiences of racism, which is also in the story. But because I don't conclude from that that everybody in the GDR was racist. And kind of go back to the dictatorship and to the sort of repressive elements of it. And because he doesn't say that where he lived was particularly horrible or anything, so this is kind of treated as I only chose that story because it doesn't fit with with the existing research. So to me, that's mind-boggling. But that is exactly, the issue with that you kind of have stories, and there's lots of them in the book, that don't necessarily go with kind of the key elements of the state that often get told, and people tend to sort of jump also from 1953 when the first big uprising happened, or the only big uprising up until 1989, straight to the peaceful revolution of 1989 and tell a kind of story of the people against the government, and finally they found, but what happened in the 30 years or so in between.
Nothing at all.
No. Well, and dissidents are still, this is also part of the problem. Dissidents were frustrated then. It was a very, very small group of people, up until 1989, that is, or up until the 1980s. But in between, it was a very, very small group of people who were so desperately opposed to the system that they either tried to flee. And yes, the numbers are huge. Of course, they're huge. 2 point something million had already fled by the time that the Berlin Wall was built. But it's still a minority, and these people were incredibly frustrated, even at the time, that they weren't able to sort of get the rest of the people to be as angry and as kind of opposed and desperate as they were. And that lingered, that kind of hatred towards the majority of people who sort of just made do and lived their lives. And I get the feeling with the controversy that I'm part of in Germany that is still there. So when you talk about these sort of ordinary people in inverted commas who kind of just got on with their lives, or people whose experience doesn't fit the story that must be told, then that immediately creates an anxiety or a form of anger in people that is difficult to argue against.
Some of the reactions I've read, I think, are fascinating because it seems to me they sort of were, it was cherry picking the bits of your book. It was, well, you don't talk about this. Well, you do actually. It was almost like you hadn't talked about the Stasi at all.
Yeah.
And you hadn't mentioned the prisons at all. And so there seems to be there's almost a sort of, I'll pick and choose the bits of your book that I like. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of microcosm of the bigger challenge here, which is sort of people wanting to paint things in a particular, seeing the world that they want to see. And what you were doing in some respects was holding a little bit of a mirror up to the world and just saying, well, it's slightly different the way it's depicted. And guess what? It's a bit more complex. And that's the bit that really came through for me was you weren't sort of saying it's a joyous, wonderful place. We should go back to those times. But equally, it wasn't all bad. And I think that balancing act struck me as being very valuable. But I'm fascinated by the response it's had, because it really, it seemed to me, grossly unfair. Some of the critiques, I genuinely thought people hadn't read the book when they were criticizing it.
Well, it's also the fact that I was, people were announcing a campaign against me before I'd even written the book. So, when I said on Twitter and elsewhere that I was writing this and sort of a bit of the framing around it, as a sort of complex, colorful history of the GDR with all the elements, the good, bad, and the ugly in it. Immediately I had a response from German people on Twitter who sort of said, this will go terribly wrong if it gets published in Germany. I can guarantee you that now. So those sorts of threats were already in the air when I hadn't even written it. It's not even like it wasn't just out yet. So it was before it was actually kind of conceived and as such on paper. So, there is an element there of kind of protecting the story that has been told, particularly by those who are telling it. This is a very, very small group of sort of pre-existing historians and experts in that field who are feel, I think, threatened by the fact that I've come from the outside. I'm also pretty untouchable in Britain. I haven't got a position or funding in Germany that can be cut or kind of threatened or undermined. So in many ways, I think it's to do with who tells the story of the GDR and how. But you're right, people quite often admit freely, when I go and do talks in Germany or debates, people admit freely as a preamble, well, I haven't read the book, but, and then they just go straight into a launch about what they hate about it. And I just find that absolutely amazing. Well, I was in the US last week, and there was a man who, apparently I didn't know this at the time, but there was a man in the audience who always comes to events of this kind of nature in Washington, D.C. So he's kind of constantly at debates and panels and things and just tries to basically make himself the center of attention and say very egregious things very loudly and then wants people to respond to that. So I didn't know that they hadn't like put a sticker on him or anything that would have been helpful. But he stood up and he actually said, again, to start with, I haven't read the book, but, and then accused me of anti-Semitism in it. I was like, that's just the most outrageous thing. I was so angry about that. It was like, yeah, I had underplayed the role that, the sort of way that East Germany was trying to use the conflict of the Arab nations with Israel for its own purposes, and it did, and I talk about that in the book as well. So the fact that basically the Federal Republic had continued to support Israel and acknowledge it and give it money, which is why it began to fall out with Egypt and the other Arab nations around there. And East Germany thought this is a brilliant way of trying to get some of these Arab nations to acknowledge it as a state and break that diplomatic stalemate that kept it isolated. And it did that in a very sort of cynical, politically calculated manner. And I talk about that, but it's not obviously the focus of the book. But he just carried on and said I deliberately left it out and I wasn't talking about that because of, my own kind of perceptions of Israel and all the rest. And it's like, where's this just come from? Completely out of nowhere. And then afterwards I learned, this is a person that always does that. So I was like, fine, nutter, let's just forget about it. But then there was a German radio show. So there was a correspondent there from a German radio broadcaster.
It's now got legs, right?
Yeah, he literally was talking about the event in Washington for 6 minutes and spent over 1 minute talking about that incident of the 6 minutes. And I just thought, why would you out of an evening that took 1.5 hours, where the Q&A wasn't even recorded for exactly those reasons, I think sometimes. Why would you choose something where she also learned afterwards from others that this person always does that and it always happens and he always just finds a random reason to be particularly offensive for reasons just known to himself? Why would you pick that to frame the evening in a way that, I was faced with severe criticism, for example, that this man stood up and said, like, Hoyer hadn't talked about anti-Semitism enough. It's like, what, how? This is exactly what happens with the book as well. People just find a random passage that they find particularly offensive, or even sometimes half a sentence, and then go,
Right.
well, you said this in the book. And I was like, even with German interviews, I've had this sometimes. So, for instance, there's one element in the 1980s chapter where a sentence starts with something like, life in the GDR was comparatively comfortable, and then it kind of carries on saying, this malaise had set in, people are getting more and more unhappy. And the entire chapter is about that. This kind of sense of something needs to happen here, this can't carry on like that. And I'm contrasting that with the comparatively high living standards compared to the rest of the Eastern Bloc, which is why it took so long in East Germany to kind of get to a point where people were going onto the streets. So I talk about that, and people literally took that half sentence out in an interview with me, in a live interview, and said, "So you say that life in the GDR was comparatively comfortable? Have you got something to say about that?" So I said to the journalist, "So how does the rest of the sentence go?" And she didn't know. She was just sat there going, "Well, you know best," and it just carried on like that. And I'm just totally baffled by the idea that people just refuse to sort of, engage with the book on its own terms. It's just constantly seen in the context of what people want the book to be, almost like there needs to be a baddie in this GDR debate, and that's me at the moment.
But I think it's incredibly interesting because as I've seen you talk about and write about elsewhere, if we look at what's happened subsequent to 1989, the divisions within the country still exist. We can look at that in political terms. We can look at that in social terms. The divides that were caused by that, the legacy of the GDR continues. And I think one of the things that really strikes me in the way that you talk about it is to say, look, if we don't confront this and have these discussions, then we're not going to heal those divisions, because it wasn't a sort of, a reunification of two equals. There was an imbalance there. And so as you tell these stories, it really strikes me that you're pressing buttons here, but I think they're really important because I think it does play into some of the challenges that the country is facing.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's certainly become part of a national conversation now that I think is really important that we finally have it. In terms of how do we speak about East Germany both before 1990 and whatever that means today. What the legacies that have remained today, and the way that we frame those, and the way that we talk not just about East Germans and not just East Germans amongst themselves about it, but East Germans with West Germans and kind of everybody with everybody about that. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of, is that the book's kind of helped inflame that debate in the best possible way, in the sense that it's now being discussed more widely and basically being talked about, and the books contributed to that. There's another book by a guy called Dirk Oschmann, who's actually a literature professor in Leipzig, but has been sort of cast as an East German so often in his life. So every time there was some sort of debate about East Germany, people say, "Oh, Dirk, you're East German. You can come and talk about this." And he's a professor of like romantic literature. He deals with like poetry and stuff in the 17th century. So he got a bit fed up with all of that, and basically wrote a very, very angry, very polemic, but quite eloquent book about the way that kind of he feels East Germans have been treated since 1990, and the kind of continuing imbalances in the economy and kind of political chances and so on. And his book's been on the bestseller list in Germany, and that's quite remarkable given that it's about East Germany and speak largely to East Germans. Um, the way that been in the bestseller list since it came out in, I think it's March or maybe February at the beginning of the year, is quite remarkable in itself. So those two books are often taken together as kind of some sort of like, oh, here's the rebellious East Germans. So my book really isn't meant in that way at all. I don't think I write in a polemic way, and I don't think I didn't know that I was particularly inflammatory until I was. But yeah, those books are often kind of, they come together. It's now often framed as the Hoyer-Oschmann debate, or the Oschmann-Hoyer debate. I'm glad I've got a debate named after me now. That's the tick off the bucket list. But yeah.
Yeah,
No.
it's funny you mention that, because I do quite a lot of traveling between London and Munich by train frequently, and in all the train station bookstores, you're exactly right. It's yours next to it.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, we were on 2 panels together recently, but this is the first time that I've sort of met him in person. It's so strange to be sort of put into one parcel or one package for something that, in my view, is completely different. I mean, as I say, the style is very different. He says very openly in the first few words that he intends to write a very inflammatory, very angry, very polemical, very one-sided book, because he feels it's the only way to be heard. Whilst I've tried to do exactly the opposite.
Right.
I've tried to be very calm, very measured, very balanced. And it's got to a point now where we were together in Berlin a few weeks ago on a panel, and the host like 5 or 6 times she addressed Dirk Oschmann with Dirk Hoyer or Herr Hoyer. And you were just sitting there going, we've somehow become some sort of projection space, where everybody can just like divert their anger about this. Even though the books I mean, of course the topics are linked, but only very vaguely. A lot of people would agree with him, but not with me, and vice versa. So, it's not the same thing to discuss those two issues. And yet, people don't actually engage with the books themselves anymore, but with what they think they say, or with what they think they project. And I think, we're back to people not even having read the books and having some sort of opinion on it. But that's, I think, due to the fact that this kind of topic, this theme, is back in people's minds, and they have very clear things that they want to argue for or against. And we've just suddenly become these pillars against one which can project all of these kind of ideas.
I mean, it's fascinating because in a way you're making history, right? In terms of the response.
I thought I was writing about it.
Right, no, exactly. And I think so. I do think there's something interesting there about driving the debate, because I think the way you talked about your desire to. I mean, obviously you're interested in the subject, the research, but there's that personal element that you talked about before bringing it to it, and so I think in some respects it seemed to me that you were. There's an aim to fulfill a purpose there, which is to shine a light on something that hasn't had a light shone on it in the way that you do. And I guess what's happening is people reacting to that light, or rather they're reacting to what they think that light is shining on. And so I think in a way you've succeeded. It's just not the way that you had wanted it to happen. But I guess you're drawing attention to the subject. So that's.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I've been very grateful to have opportunities, on the back of that to talk about the GDR more. So, in terms of media interest in it, it's been immense in Germany. I had to cut it short in the end because obviously my life is normally anyway based in the UK. And, I've spent a lot of time in the summer traveling over there and trying to take part in the debate as much as I possibly can. But Oschmann is just insane. I mean, he's out there like 2-3 times a week, literally talking in different locations all across Germany, talking about this. I couldn't even keep up with that, but that's a novelty that's completely new. The fact that people are suddenly interested in East Germany. It's a lot to do with the political anxiety that's around at the moment, so particularly with the fear of the rise of the AfD, the far right party in Germany, which now is currently polling as the second largest party in the general election, what were to happen now. And as a result of that, like even politicians, I've had several meetings, and I've got more scheduled now with people from different political parties who want to know whether there's anything that they can do to kind of win East German voters. But I don't know how helpful I can be
Wow.
with that. But there's suddenly a real desire, because it's relevant to now, a real desire to talk about these things. And I'm also, I mean, I'm not getting too distracted, I think, with kind of responding to this very loud public debate that's going on there, because a lot underneath that level are a lot of people who are genuinely interested, be that, as I say, political advisors, politicians themselves, lots of people from the media. I've had people calling me up saying, I was so angry when I saw the book review in our paper. Like people from that paper would call me up and say, I now want to do an interview with you to make sure that, we're giving our readers like both sides, because they think it's irresponsible to just leave it sort of sitting there. So there are an awful lot of people, and often also people who don't want to say anything in public because they're frightened of exactly the sort of storm that has come my way. To kind of draw that upon themselves, because it can actually be damaging to, your reputation, your career, and also personally just very aggravating when you're suddenly getting bombarded with all of this kind of very hostile stuff.
Yeah.
But
It's not what you signed up for, right?
no, exactly. But there are people, particularly journalists, who sort of feel that they have to be cautious in terms of the way that they interact with me and my book. But in private, they'll kind of come and say, like, can we talk about this? Because my own history is this, that, and the other. And I had one from ARD, which is like the sort of German equivalent to the BBC, the BBC One. So he sat opposite me and he literally had tears in his eyes. He just said, like, I'm the only East German who works here. I'm the only one that knows what my own history is. He's constantly confronted with people who don't want to hear anything about East Germany. Every time he wants to do a feature on it, the others just roll their eyes and go, oh, you're East, why don't you just go back there if you like it so much, kind of thing. And he was just finding it, such a liberation almost to now be able to cover that topic and talk about it. So there's a lot of that. And when you look at kind of normal book reviews as well on Amazon and stuff, Goodreads, most German readers also respond really positively. And it's not a self-selecting audience. I've got plenty of West Germans who sort of write to me and say this is the first time I've actually found it interesting to engage with the GDR, because I wasn't told what to make of it all, and I wasn't just getting the expected dates and people and kind of narratives.
Wow. Astonishing stuff. Now, I mentioned the story about genes, but I'm just going to say to people, read the book and they'll discover what that is, because I actually want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about your next project, because from my perspective, and I'm sure this is pleasant, suddenly you came out with this announcement and say the next book is called Weimar. And I just went, whoa, there's another one already in the plan. So tell us about that. And obviously, I will just judge what it's about already, because I don't need to read it to have an opinion on it.
No, of course not.
I mean, obviously, I have been there. I have heard of it. There's a republic named after it. What's the inspiration? Where are you going with that one?
No, I think you summed it up quite nicely there. Yeah,
it's a tourist book, right? It's talking about architecture. Right?
Yeah, and poetry and Goethe. Weimar is just such a fascinating place. So people think, especially not in Germany, people will immediately think Weimar Republic, and that I get that a lot. It's like, oh, okay, so you're writing about that now. It's another chapter of the sort of German story. So the idea is basically that I'm looking at Weimar between the two world wars, between World War I and World War II, so from 1919 to 39. And what I'm going to do is use Weimar as a sort of microcosm for which I look at kind of what happened at that time on a human level. So the fact that Weimar was basically the place where lots of people thought the new Germany should reinvent itself. So you had this absolute catastrophe of the First World War, the first real kind of big test that the German nation, which was still very young, founded in 1871, had gone through, and it had nearly broken it. So it had kind of come out humiliated, defeated, utterly disorientated, young men on the streets with weapons fighting each other. It was horrible in 1918, 1919. And people were looking at what had gone wrong. They'd lost the monarchy. Where was Germany supposed to start again now that it's lost everything, including its leadership and its army? And a lot of people immediately came up with the idea that it couldn't be Berlin. For one thing, Berlin was sort of very fragile still politically, so even meeting there was dangerous. But people also wanted to get away from Prussian, what they perceived to be Prussian militarism, and sort of start again in a neutral place almost. And so Bavaria was out of the question, the south was out of the question, as was the north. So they came up with Weimar because it's literally in the middle. It's almost exactly in the middle of Germany, which makes quite a neat sort of metaphor as well as kind of the heart of Germany, if you will. But also it was associated with the sort of high period, if you will, of German culture. So you had sort of Goethe and Schiller and all the great thinkers, Nietzsche, all sorts of people, musicians, composers. It's always been a place of high culture. Even when you go there today, you can sort of sense that pride in it. It's a very pretty town. Everything is very neatly kept. The facades are all very lovely. Everything is still historical as it always was. There's a Goethe house and all that. So people basically thought this was where they could start a new civilized Germany that is not based on militarism, but on ideas, on philosophy, on music, on culture. Hence why the rebranding of Germany as the Weimar Republic and giving that whole sort of name to it. But also the far right immediately thought this is where the true heart of Germany is. So from the beginning, you have people like Hindenburg, who had by then become almost like a legend because he was the leader of the East German army, of the German army, my Freudian mind now, of the German army on the Eastern Front. And therefore, in the early years of the war, when Germany was making huge gains there with the Battle of Tannenberg and things, so he retained this kind of status of a war hero. And he also thought, bringing kind of the German right, the nationalists together, in Weimar would also kind of be a form of Germany's national revival. Then you have people like avant-garde artists, like the Bauhaus movement, who come to Weimar and think, right, avant-garde, kind of these ultra-liberal people, avant-garde culture, and the new Germany starts here. So it's really, really interesting to me how people from all sorts of, like literally across the political spectrum and across the cultural spectrum thought, this is the place, this is where we start Germany. And yet it's also the first place that falls to fascism. So Thuringia, the state where Weimar is it has got a fascist government, a Nazi government from 1930s, earlier, 2 years earlier, or 3 years earlier, than the rest of the country, basically, with its centralized government. It's also the only place that doesn't ban the Nazi party, so hence why Hitler's very intrigued when he comes out of prison. He goes there straight away and says, right, this is where we start. So he holds all of his Nazi conventions in Weimar. So the Hitler Youth is founded there, and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm just wondering what goes on in the minds of the people of Weimar who live in that town as all of that is unfolding. So how do they respond to things like the kind of immediate aftermath of the war, the hunger, the starvation, then hyperinflation, the political chaos? What do they think when Hitler comes to their town and raves about, Jews and kind of the Treaty of Versailles and all that? What do they think when the dignitaries from Berlin come down to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Weimar Republic and they come to celebrate democracy in the very same place, in the very same theater where the state was founded basically at the time. So I'm gonna look at a whole cross section of people, like ordinary people, teachers and builders and workers and all sorts of people, the mayor, but also kind of the Hitlers, the Hindenburgs. Goebbels immediately is totally taken with Weimar when he first sets foot in it and is totally enthralled with the idea of its Germanness, basically. So that's the idea, and because normally we kind of finish German history, one chapter of it in 1933, and then open another chapter, and we don't really think about the fact that the people that do stuff in the 1930s were also around in the 1920s and vice versa.
Right.
So what does somebody do? If you're say a doctor in the 1920s and you're just a GP in Weimar, and then suddenly, you get told from 1933, right, you're not treating Jews anymore. You need to follow a sort of eugenicist, racist way of kind of exercising your profession. You find out that Buchenwald is next door. You might get asked to treat people there. You know it's there. Like, how do you respond to that? Do you carry on? Do you join the Nazi party because you probably have to if you want to keep your profession? Or do you plunge yourself into poverty out of a sense of I'm doing the right thing here and risk being taken to the nearby, literally nearby, just outside this Buchenwald, the largest on German soil, the largest concentration camp, just outside, which is a huge kind of looms over the town. So, I'm interested in these kind of human decisions and the way that people respond to these things. And there's lots of very, very complicated story where you think somebody's an absolute sort of perpetrator and an absolute arsehole 1 minute, and then the next minute you go, oh, is that why they did it? And you kind of have a sense of what's happening to them. Or vice versa, you think, somebody is actually a really good person, and then suddenly they sense an opportunity to further their own career and they end up kind of quite high up the Nazi hierarchy. So it's interesting to me to use that as a kind of microcosm to see kind of why the stuff happened that did happen in Germany.
Wow. My preconceptions about the book didn't go into that level of detail, but now that you've told me that, I can have much better preconceptions about what you're going to write. So that I can critique. Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'll tell you what I absolutely love is just the way you talk about it. This is clearly, yes, you're interested in academic level, but there's this absolute human curiosity and a desire to understand what drives people, motivates them. And so I think that was just a wonderful way of describing what stimulated you to do it. And if nothing else, that's going to get people to read the current book, because there's just this, I don't know, this real sort of force of curiosity and nature and humanness in the way you talk about things. So I want to say, one, looking forward to it, and would love to have you back on the show when that's out to talk about it, so that I can make sure my preconceptions are correct. But the second thing is, thank you so much for all the research and all the things you do. It sounds like you were having one hell of a time. But I just want to say, on behalf of those of us that are just genuinely interested in finding out what the hell has happened in the world, you're adding a huge amount. I also love the color that you add to what's going on at the moment. And as someone that spends a lot of time in Germany, you're answering a ton of my questions. And thank you for also explaining to me why I feel out of sorts when I shift from A to B very, very quickly. But Katja, above all, thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the show.
No, thank you very much. That was very nice. I'm blushing here, which your viewers won't be able to see. But yeah, thank you. That's very kind. No, it's good to know that my ramblings sometimes make sense to people.
No, totally does make sense. And your written ramblings, he said, being rude, well, I will put links to in the show notes. So I'll make sure that there's a link to Zeitgeist, your podcast, your Substack, and of course, the book, and plenty of other things that you put out there. But thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Katja for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Katja, Beyond the Wall, the other publications that are there, including her highly recommended Substack and podcast, have a look in the show notes. You'll find links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed in the past, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.